So for a little bit of background for you and what drew me to this book in defense of doping, Alexander, I, for a long time on my radio show, and then also, I guess, to a lesser degree on the podcast, because it doesn't come up as much on the podcast, have been someone who has lobbied for the legalization of all performance-enhancing drugs in sports. And that's not necessarily because I want to see people cheating or I want to see people turn into mutants or superhumans who are defying the law of physics, although that is kind of the point of the athleticism in sports. But I also see the subject as being rife with hypocrisy and a lot of questionable rulings in terms of what is or what is not considered a performance-enhancing drug, especially as compared to how we tend to look at these same things in just our day-to-day lives as humans. And so in reading this book, I think that you provided me with a lot of ammunition for any time I had this conversation in the future. For you as somebody who obviously feels strongly about this, and you've done a ton of research, and your life is built around exercise physiology and nutrition, what was the impetus for you to want to write this book?
Well, much like you, for years, well, maybe not entirely like you, but for myself, I was not pro-doping, and I'm still not pro-doping. So I just want to be clear on that. But when you go through the process of gaining a higher level of education, like a PhD, you can't avoid just consuming gobs and gobs and gobs of information. What you're supposed to do is get it on both sides so that you can actually form a rational and coherent, unbiased, objective opinion on the subject that you're actually studying at the time. At the time, when I was in my early 20s, when I was looking at Lance Armstrong in particular and seeing what he was going through and what he was doing, I became rather suspicious of him towards the end of his 7-year run. But at the same time, I didn't really care that he was potentially taking something. What I cared about was the way that he was treating people to defend himself. So therein lies where I kind of wadded him up and just tossed him away because I was pissed off with the way that he treated people. But I couldn't care less about the doping because I was quite certain that he was continuing the same pattern of behavior that he had been taught when he came in the professional ranks early in his career. And I also knew how much the Tour de France, cycling, and then all of the peripheral industries that feed into it were monetizing his performance and feeding off of what he was doing and becoming remarkably rich in doing so. It wasn't until I was, about halfway through my PhD that I kind of switched sports from being mostly swimming to starting to get into things that were at that time going to be akin to what CrossFit became, because this was early in the early aughts, and I think CrossFit, for some I really saw was around 2008, and triathlon. That was another sport that I did at a relatively high level. And, when you cross over that barrier from your 20s into your 30s, you start picking up these little nagging injuries. And for me, it was plantar fasciitis, and the crippling impact of bad feet on anything that I would relate as an athletic career for myself also was an eye-opening experience to see really they don't have a whole lot to treat you with when it comes to plantar fasciitis. The primary thing they're going to hit you with is going to be cortisone injections, and they helped immensely. But then when I look and see that one of the primary drugs that they will get you for in sports, particularly cycling, is cortisone injections. I understand why they can be used as a performance-enhancing drug, but when you also take a look at the toll that a 3-week tour race takes on a human body, you can understand why some level of pharmaceutical assistance is going to be necessary just to get them on the bike day after day after day. God forbid they crash. And I've gone down hard, but never as hard as these guys do at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. And they still get back on their bike and they keep riding the next day. And to suggest to anybody that you could do that without getting some level of drug help is just insane to me. And it doesn't really happen. It's not true. So we compile all of these different world experiences, these worldly experiences over a period of about 10, 15, maybe 20 years. And then finally you start to come to the conclusion that what we're doing to these athletes, particularly when we catch them, is just ridiculous. So what really triggered it and sent it over the edge for me, I'd already written my first 2 books and I was trying to formulate a plan for what I was going to do for my next one. And this is 2021-ish. So the Summer Olympic trials are now a year late and we have Sha'Carri Richardson going up to run for the 100-meter dash. She wins it. Not even close. She's going to be the favorite to go to Tokyo to win there. And 2 or 3 days later, it's explained that she's going to be out because she consumed THC, the active ingredient in marijuana. I just couldn't believe. I didn't realize that WADA had banned those types of drugs. And they didn't, at the time, they didn't say anything about marijuana being a performance enhancing drug. It was just called a drug of abuse. And the theory being that athletes should be held to a higher standard because they're role models for everybody below them, yada, yada, yada. And so because of this, she now has to be disqualified and then paraded out to every morning show she can possibly go to apologize for what I'm not entirely sure. You know, she consumed a plant that grows naturally in all but one continent on our planet. Where is that a moral issue? Where is that an ethical issue? It isn't for me. And if you understand the reason why she did what she did, then you can truly empathize with her and say that this is just preposterous how we treat these people. She was raised by her grandmother and two of her aunts, so she didn't have much of any relationship with her biological mother. And journalist ambushed her with a gotcha question or an equivalent of basically said, Shikari, how do you respond to knowing that your biological mother died yesterday? She had no idea. So now she's hammered with this terrible news, which brings back a million different memories as she's trying to prepare herself for the final. And her response to that in Portland, Oregon, or I guess it was in Eugene, where it's legal, was to find someone who had marijuana. And I don't know if she smoked it or ate it. It doesn't matter. She got some in herself. It calmed her down enough that she could continue to function, and she ran the race and she won it. You know, the alternative to that they would allow her to take would be something like Xanax or some other type of drug like that.
A pharmaceutical.
A pharmaceutical. And I can tell you from my own experience with Xanax, because I took it for a while for sleep, that once my doctors decided they didn't want me taking it anymore after 5 years, the cold turkey to get off of Xanax was brutal. And it was very unpleasant.
I believe benzos is one of the few things on this planet that you can literally die from detoxing.
You can. It's tough. And I mean, luckily I didn't have it that bad. It only took me about a week to get to the point where I could sleep, but there was 3 straight days of just having no sleep at all. So if I had a preference between taking a gummy versus a pharmaceutical of that sort. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a place within our society. Of course they do. If you have a serious panic attack, you need to come down. That's a great thing to take. But take it on a regular basis, I would not recommend that for anybody. I would much rather they take some THC.
Yeah, they're also overprescribed. We won't get into the weeds on
prescribed. But there's a reason for that to be legitimate and this to be not. And then we contrast that with, there was a Russian figure skater, and she was only a teenager, but she popped for taking a drug that had been on the banned list for quite some time. And her handlers knew that she was taking it, and they tried to cover it up. And the WADA's ruling on that was effectively, we're going to let her finish out the competition, and then we'll adjudicate this on the other end. And then they finally ended up actually disqualifying her. She wasn't going to be in the medal stand anyway, so that's fine. But to see the difference between how they allowed for a Russian athlete to proceed the entire way through, knowing full well that she had violated their drug code, and they let it happen. But Shikari Richardson has to be made an example of right there on the spot. That's ridiculous. So it's not evenly handed in terms of their adjudication of the penalties associated with a drug violation. That makes it just remarkably unfair. And then we can back that up even further when we look at the Chinese swim team in Tokyo. 21 members of the swim team tested positive for at least 1 and maybe 2 different drugs, and they argued to WADA, well, it was an accidental contamination. It was our fault. We apologize. And they said, it's fine. And so they let them swim anyway. Now, had that happened in the United States, they would have eviscerated everybody. They would have expected USADA to do everything that they tell them to do. But China and Russia, they get away with these things. And there's a reason that they get away with these things. It's much, much, much easier to put on a game or any event of the magnitude of the Summer or Winter Olympics in a nation where you have a dictator. Because you don't have a city council to go in front of. You don't have any of these politicians that you have to make sure you follow all these particular regulations. You just go to the one guy in charge and say, this is what we want done. This is how much money it's going to get you. This is how much prestige, whatever. And then they get it done. And if they have to bulldoze a bunch of people's houses, they don't have to answer to anybody for it. So the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, loves to put on these types of events in totalitarian dictatorship countries, and not so much on the other side. They'll do it because they'll still make money, but it's always going to be harder having to go to a Paris or an LA than it is anywhere in China or Russia.
So let's rewind just a little bit, because you said that you're not necessarily for doping per se, but you do see the hypocrisy like I do. For people who maybe aren't totally familiar, what exactly is doping, and where did that term come from? Because I've heard the term dope before, but it's typically referred to heroin or maybe even marijuana.
Sure.
But doping itself in terms of the act of ingesting something that is going to help with performance, where did that come from?
So there's a drink that was created somewhere on the African continent, and it's believed somewhere in the southern half of the African continent. It was called doop. It was mostly fermented alcohol that they would make from fruits, but the warriors would take this to steel themselves before battle or before their practices for battle, which tended to be something like an athletic event, if you would imagine. And that turned into, dope, which has a number of different derivations that you can have. But anything that's going to allow for you to prepare yourself mentally and physically for the pain that's going to be associated with the athletic events you're about to take on. Almost always primarily before that associated with battle. Okay. Now, athletics by and large was developed as a practice for battle, and then also as just a less violent means of allowing for two tribes or two towns to compete against each other in battle-like things without having to kill themselves.
Sure.
All right. So this was a way of actually trying to keep the peace. And all of these different cultures had a number of different ways that they would get themselves prepared for these events because they wanted to perform better than they could if they didn't have that, or at least they thought so. Right. So that's where that initial term came from. Now, in the modern terms, when we think about doping, the first time I ever heard about blood doping was related to blood transfusions. Now, that's an old technology, but where it came to the fore was in the 1984 Olympics. It was not illegal in terms of a method to be used to enhance performance then. And so the U.S. men's and some of the women's track national cycling team took homologous blood transfusions from their relatives who matched their blood type, but they didn't screen anything for diseases or anything at all. So they just had them all in a hotel room. They would have the athlete laying on the floor, their relative in the bed, and they would string a tube from one person to the next and just take. I mean, that's literally what happened.
In 1984.
1984.
You hear about bloodletting from like the 1700s where they're trying to bleed the disease out of somebody. That's insane that it was happening in 1984.
1984. So then it was banned by the IOC in 85 because there was such an uproar about this. So therein lies where that term has been modernized. What it means now is basically anything that you can consume or any method that you can use to enhance your performance. That is really the long and the short of it. Now, what does that mean in terms of the WADA, so the World Anti-Doping Agency? They are the organization that's run by the IOC, so it's not like they're separate entities. They are one and the same effectively. And they have their set of criteria for either a drug or a practice that would be considered illegal. Okay, so it is a 3-tiered system, and only one of these has to apply in order for it to be put on the banned list. So the first one is that it will provide an athletic enhancement. Now, we have some classic drugs that we know for certain do. So cortisol would be towards the top of that list. So cortisol is a steroid hormone that, this is actually going to be cortisone. We actually produce our own of this. It's called cortisol. It's associated with a number of different things, but when we take it as a drug, what you're trying to do is knock down inflammation. So if you think of, if anybody's ever had one, you would get this into a joint usually. If I ever get the flu or a really bad cold, the first thing I'll ask for is for them to give me a cortisone injection.
Oh, really?
Because I have such an overactive immune response to those illnesses that it's not the virus or the bacteria that's causing me the trouble. It's my body going, what? Just freaking out.
Where do they give you that injection?
My butt. Just give you a quick shot. And so, if you do it intramuscularly, it goes into the muscle and it'll slowly just let that stuff out over time.
Oh, interesting.
The alternative is that you get a little blister pack that they call a taper pack. So you get like 6 the first day, then 5, 3 on. It's the same thing, except for when you take that blister pack, your levels go up higher and faster. And so if you've ever had the opportunity to take one of these, then you feel like Superman, like immediately, like within a couple hours, like, oh, I feel so much better. I was sick, but I'm now feeling great. The problem being that it keeps you up like crazy that night, right? So it's going to keep you awake.
A cortisone shot does.
The shot won't, but the blister pack pills will.
Gotcha.
Because their levels are higher. With the cortisone shot is if they do it right, which they should. If you go intramuscularly, it'll take some time to leak that out over time. And so you get more of a steady release of that drug. So you don't get kept up as much for that. But the point being, it's going to bring down inflammation.
And that's a great example also of the not just the hypocrisy, but the different rules that exist for a drug that in some cases is completely fine, like Major League Baseball or pretty much any U.S. professional sport where a guy gets a cortisone shot, whereas WADA has it on their banned list, so it's something that cyclists can't take during the Tour de France, yet the WTA, professional tennis, you're right about a great example of Rafa Nadal in the French Open, professional tennis allows cortisone shots. So even within WADA's supposedly yet arcane rules, there's no consistency there with this particular performance enhancer.
That's right. Now, for the domestic leagues that you're talking about, so we're talking about all the U.S. leagues. So it's going to be NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, and hockey, and MLS. They're not signatories of WADA. So they don't follow WADA regulations. They have their own set of rules that they've established. And this is where the crux of my argument comes in. And we'll get back to the three criteria for it to be a banned substance in a minute. But since we're going to talk about this anyway, it's really important that we talk now. This is where my argument goes, is that in the United States, each of those leagues has to bargain collectively with the athletes and their players' union. And so they get union rights and they get a stake in order to negotiate salary, time off, benefits, pensions, etc., in exchange for however much of the cut they're going to get from the pie that's there. So the rules and regulations in terms of what is and is not allowed between the international sports and the domestic sports, completely different. The first time ban for a player in the NFL is going to be 4 games. So basically a quarter of one season. The first time ban for somebody on the international scene at minimum is 2 years, and more likely now is 4. The reason being that they want you to miss at least one Olympic cycle. So it's nothing at all about your safety. It's nothing all about education. It's all about punishment. If you do anything to mark up this shield, we're going to punish you to the hilt. And that's exactly what they do. So there is zero representation of athletes on the international scene. They get exploited to the max. The International Olympic Committee makes billions of dollars off of their games every single year, every 4-year cycle, and actually 2 because you go summer, then 2 years for winter, and et cetera. And the athletes get nothing. Absolutely nothing. You get 0 for winning a medal at the Olympics in terms of from the Olympic Committee. We're still, once you get home, you got to pay taxes on that medal that you won. So, I mean, it's punitive across the board. So anyway, back to what it takes to be this, an illegal substance, a banned substance. It has to have an enhancing effect. Now, like I was saying, we have a list of older drugs, and the top of that list is going to be anabolic steroids. We know they have a performance enhancing effect for sure. But for the rest of them that they have on there, they may not. There's not a lot of testing out there. Certainly within this country, one, it's going to be very difficult for an independent researcher at a university to get enough grant funding to test that to begin with. They're not going to get a grant from the NIH to test whether or not drug X enhances athletic performance, because that's not the mandate of the NIH. So it's difficult to get testing done in the first place in terms of just the resources. But also, anytime you're going to go through a study with a human, you have to go through what's called an internal review board, basically to make sure that you're not doing anything to harm that human. They're never going to approve, not never. It's going to be rare that they will approve you to do a study to see if this drug makes that person faster. There's just too many possibilities in terms of harming that person. So what you have is basically a guess. We think that this is going to be the case, so we're going to err on side of caution. At the very least, your athlete A is using it, hoping that there's going to be an advantage, so we're going to assume that there is one. So there's that one. The second one is that it has to potentially harm the athlete. Again, it's tricky to say whether or not it does. You don't know the dosage. You don't know how often they're taking it. You don't know what the potential ramifications of this are. If you drink too much water and you've been sweating for too long, you can become hyponatremic. So not being glib, but anything that you take in excess can potentially be harmful to the body.
Well, the most obvious example and something that is considered a drug too is alcohol.
Sure.
But a lot of these sports leagues are profiting
funded by alcohol.
Off of alcohol. So of course they're not going to consider something like that a harmful substance.
Sure. But then not only alcohol, but as we were talking about pharmaceuticals, if you got a chance to watch the Paris Olympics, every fourth ad was for some horrible, Ozempic or something of that equivalent. So these are all diseases that are mostly happening to you because of excess, particularly if it's type 2 diabetes. And instead of actually talking about changing your diet or your exercise habits or your sleep, just take this drug It'll make it easier for you.
Yeah.
That's a performance-enhancing drug too, but we don't call it that. So finally, there's the third one, and it is the catch-all. So if the drug in question or the practice in question does not meet either of the first two criteria, we can still catch it with the last one, which is that it is against the spirit of sport.
Wow,
which means nothing.
Yeah, exactly. What a vague jumble of words that you can pretty much put anything on.
100% subjective, and anybody on WADA can just say it's against the spirit of sport. Done. So which is effectively what they've done with illicit drugs. Now, there may be something like speed or cocaine could potentially be a performance-enhancing drug for some sports, but not marijuana. I mean, there's just no way you're going to get any performance-enhancing benefit from marijuana in a sport that requires a great deal of focus or a great deal of speed or ballistic activities. It's just not going to happen. So again, you come back to, I think initially the idea was a good one. We had a lot of athletes who were doing a great deal of harm to themselves by taking well more than they would ever need to actually enhance their athletic performance of any particular drug. But what we really focus on there is going to be steroids. So anabolic steroids, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and to some degree into the 90s, did a tremendous amount of damage to a lot of people for a long time. And so they should have been pulled back.
Because dosing was a complete guesswork.
Total. And not only that, but we have no idea where you're getting this drug from. It's not coming from a pharmaceutical agency.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'll give you an example of a drug that's very popular amongst bodybuilders in particular, and that's human growth hormone. It likely does have some performance-enhancing abilities, but what I like human growth hormone for, and I've never used it myself, but the research is very clear on this, is that it helps heal connective tissue. So we're talking primarily about ligaments and tendons. Now, the problem with taking steroids is that it makes your muscles grow fast and big. But muscles are heavily vascularized. They get lots of blood flow, so they get plenty of nutrients in there. They get all the raw materials they need to respond to that signal from the anabolic steroids to get bigger. The problem is that the connective tissue, either your tendons that attach the muscle to the bone or ligaments between two bones, they're very poorly vascularized. So if you damage one of those tissues, it takes forever to heal if it ever heals at all. And so what we see a lot of the times is that you get these massive muscles that are pulling on these very weak tendons and they pop. Happens all the time. And so to curtail that, to try to prevent that from happening, HGH actually does work on those connective tissues and allows them to grow bigger and faster, not to the same degree as the muscle, but they can at least try to catch up.
As a matter of fact, HGH was, I think, the starting point for me in suggesting that we need to really rethink what we think we know, what we believe about PEDs, because do you want these guys not to be able to heal up a little bit faster to get back on the field of play? And you talk about that specific to somebody who was an old high school nemesis of yours, Andy Pettitte, of course, of the New York Yankees and then the Houston Astros.
I do. So he was never a nemesis of mine specifically because I didn't play baseball, but he knocked my high school out of the playoffs my sophomore year, and then went on to, I think they were runners up in the state tournament. But then I followed him thereafter because we all knew as we sat there watching him that this guy was going places. But in 2002 and in 2004, I think those are the correct years, he had first a torn UCL tendon in his elbow, and then in 2004 it was severed, completely popped.
So that's where Tommy John surgery comes into
play. You have
play.
to have Tommy John surgery. You got to get that fixed. There's no way around that. But he was desperate. He wanted to stay on the field with his teammates. He wanted to earn his keep. Every person does. And so unadvisedly, he took a couple of shots of HGH that he got from his dad, who got it from some other person. And again, so herein lies, it's I don't want to be careful with my analogies here, but my argument for reproductive rights in terms of abortion is that making abortion illegal doesn't make it go away. It just makes it very dangerous. Making these drugs illegal doesn't make it go away. It just makes it so they're getting it from God knows where. So
it becomes more of a science experiment
than anything else, and a garage science experiment as opposed to a legitimate one. So, he did what he did. And looking at it, did it actually enhance his performance at all? In my book, I point out it just didn't. I mean, you can compare his numbers to when he was taking the HGH to before. They were even down just a little bit, but it basically just kept him level.
Yeah. And
the same thing is true for the second time that he did it. Just kept him level. Now, that's going to keep him out of the Hall of Fame. should never be out of the Hall of Fame.
Despite the fact that he admitted it too, which I think has been a big reason why we haven't seen some of these other guys get into the Hall of Fame, because they refused to acknowledge what they were actually doing.
So stupid.
He admitted his fault. He apologized for it. So you need to show a little bit more compassion in that.
I think so too. And besides,
especially because a lot of these other obvious users are in now because they never tested positive. Right. They never had to lie in front of Congress. Right. We just have to, cover our eyes and plug our ears and just assume nothing bad ever happened. I'm sorry, watching Pudge Rodriguez, I'm a Rangers fan. I'm sorry, I know you're an Astros fan. I'm a Rangers fan. And so I watched Pudge Rodriguez get swole, and I watched him shrink back down to size with the Detroit Tigers and beyond. So Pudge is one of those guys who, in all likelihood, did use steroids or some other performance enhancer to get to that size. But I also still think he should be in the Hall of Fame, too.
Because it's a Hall of Fame, not a hall of ethical behavior.
Yeah.
I don't look to these people as any type of a role model. I'm paying you to entertain me. You're gladiators. So you do your job, and I'll sit here and do mine. Where I have a problem is when we cross over that boundary and we say, I want to be entertained, but only under these very specific rules. Why? What do you care if they're taking this, that, or the next thing? Their sports are inherently dangerous as it is. Now, I'm not baseball. Certainly, you can take a pitch to the head. You can take a solid liner right up to the head if you're a pitcher. But that's really the extent of where you're going to have issues. We've taken out players at the plate in terms of blocking it, and I think they should have. But another sport like football or basketball, where there's basketball's contact, football's full collision, those are remarkably dangerous sports. So we're already putting them in harm's way with every single snap of the ball. In cycling, it's even more dangerous than you could even conceive. I mean, you've got these guys that are flying down mountains, and if you've seen the roads that they have to go down, they're much better now than they used to be even 10 years ago. But they're basically just, in many instances, just gravel. And we're talking 40, 50, 60, even 80 miles an hour downhill, hairpin turns in rain, in heat that's so hot that it melts the tarmac and turns it into goop, and you slide out and crash. And we're still sitting here saying, how dare you take this drug to ease your pain so that you could go do your job? Anything that you and I would take, we'd be popping aspirin or even a cortisone pill if we had to go do our job. These guys can't to do their job. So, again, it is very nuanced, but it's certainly not a black and white issue. You can't just look at somebody and say, because they took this particular drug, that if they were in a different sport, they could take without anybody talking about it. And now they're bad. That is now a bad person who my child should not look up to, and I'm going to have to re-educate my children. Oh, come on, give me a break. It's someone making a living. And then we come back to this idea, and I put this in my book, about how many of us take a performance-enhancing drug in every element of our lives to enhance our performance at work, at relationships, at sex, at any number of things that you could potentially think of, weight loss. But we don't call these things performance-enhancing drugs because they're not specifically within the arena of sport. It doesn't matter. It's still a performance enhancer. So my example that I put in my book, and this is something I never knew about beforehand, but if you look at symphony musicians, you have in terms of the top tier symphonies throughout the country, there might be 15 or 16. And then in even any given year, you'll have 5 or 6 spots that might open up. And then you have to, try out for that particular position in the symphony. And so in terms of the total amount of competition that there are for spaces in that sport versus something like football, there's way fewer in symphonies than there is in the NFL. And there's way more people that are coming out with a music performance degree than there are people who are going to be eligible to even consider going into the NFL. So this group of symphony musicians, there is a national organization that basically is there for the purposes of representing them. And regularly they will send out surveys to ask questions about different things. And one of them that they sent out 5 or 6 years ago was about beta blockers. So think of a symphony musician. Obviously, the primary thing that they're going to be using is their hands one way or the other. And they need steady hands. So one of the things that's going to obviously knock out their steady hands is if their heart's beating hard and fast because they have some level of performance anxiety. That's what they call it. I just think you're getting psyched up for your competition because it is a competition.
Adrenaline is pumping, yeah.
Adrenaline's pumping.
Stand-up comedians talk about this. You get the butterflies in your stomach.
Absolutely.
You get a little bit jittery. That can actually be seen as a good thing. But
you're right.
If you're still jittery when you're playing that instrument, it can be problematic for the sound that you're making.
Particularly particularly for someone who's not used to being in that position. For you and I as athletes in our lives, we've been there a million times. If I wasn't a little bit jittery, I'm not going to perform well. I just know. Now, if I go over the top, I'm going to have a bad swim. But if I'm just kind of like, I know I'm going to have a bad swim too. It's just not going to happen. So the question is, have you ever taken a beta blocker, and did you think it'd have a positive impact on your performance that day? So a beta blocker is a drug that blocks the adrenaline receptor on the heart. So it prevents you getting that fight or flight response. You don't get your heart speeding up, nor do you get an increase in contractility, which means how hard it beats. But it's a combination of both. You don't want your heart beating fast or hard because it makes it difficult to hold your instrument. You know the number that actually came through? Now, you read the book, so you're kind of cheating there, but maybe you'll remember.
I'm trying to remember, was it like 70?
73%.
Yeah.
73% of the people that were surveyed across the country who were symphony musicians had taken a beta blocker, and around 45% thought it had a positive impact on them in their performance. How is that not a performance-enhancing drug? How do we just look past this and not give a shit? I'll tell you, part of the reason why is because when I go to the symphony, and I go regularly, I don't have an emotional and vested interest in the players in that row or anywhere in there. Like, I don't want to see them give me a really great show. When I go to an athletic competition, I have an emotional investment in my university of choice, my professional team of choice, or my athlete of choice. And so they're entirely different in terms of what we're willing to put into it. And so there's some, certainly maybe 10 or 15, 20 years ago, when there was a revelation that Lance Armstrong had actually cheated, people were devastated because they all believed him. And they should have believed him. Why wouldn't you if you don't really understand the ins and outs of cycling? If you don't understand the nuances of a particular sport, and you can't look at it and say, that's kind of suspicious.
Yeah.
Then you're probably not going to know. But you're not going to have that same feeling if you go to look at a symphony musician. You're not.
It's people that only examine the uttermost surface of something and then move on to that next thing. It's the people who get their news from, let's say, Twitter. It's like 280 characters is informing you on what's going on versus looking or thinking a little bit deeper about something.
But you'd have to have the motivation to look or think deeper in the first place.
You're right, and I come at it from somebody who was in sports radio in Austin back when Lance was doing his thing.
This is what we're addicted to.
At first, it was a great story, but he was also building his reputation as the one guy who was actually doing it cleanly, having survived cancer and enriching himself and continuing to win races as a result. But then you continue to watch it over time. You're like, I don't know if this makes sense. And then former teammates start coming out and try and be truthful about things, not throwing him under the bus, just being truthful about themselves. And then he goes after them, as you talked about, getting a little bit sick of watching him do that over and over again. So I come at it from a unique perspective. I get it. But yes, a lot of people were devastated when he finally did admit what was going on.
And, and I don't blame them for their
naivete.
Yeah, because I don't think that it's necessarily that. I don't think any fans were going into this wanting to just stick their head in the sand. I think they just didn't know what they're looking at. I mean, writing looks like writing looks like writing looks like writing. Unless you have been through something equivalent to it as much as you can be as an athlete.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what you're looking at. And so, I mean, I've got lots of casual football fans who they look at a formation, they can't tell what play is coming. Yeah. But everybody around me who knows football, we all know what play is coming. And when we do get tricked, it's a rare occasion, and we're all very excited by it because we know the sport. But that's different than the mass populace who's consuming these things.
Yeah.
And certainly it's different than kids or anybody else. So it makes sense to me that they didn't understand what they were looking at and that they were that pissed off, where I wish that they would have gone as a collective unit instead of turning their backs on a great sport and walking away, would be to take some time to actually understand how long this has been going on, and that it's not just Lance, it's everybody else, and how many other people knew what he was doing who were in charge and covered up for him because they wanted the sport to grow and they wanted to cash out just like he did. But the minute they had the opportunity, they threw him under the bus.
How long have Tour de France cyclists been taking performance enhancers, Alexander?
Since 1903 when it started. Now, what those enhancing drugs were, usually back in the day, we were talking brandy, wine, but they also took shit. Sorry, is that?
You're good, yeah.
Okay. Morphine would be a big one. They took plenty of that. Strychnine is another excellent one that we usually consider as being a poison, because it literally is, but it's also a tremendous muscle stimulant. And so people would take that to, stave off fatigue. Amphetamines would have come in post-World War II because that's effectively right around the time that they were developed and produced in mass quantities to help athletes, soldiers on either side of the conflict stay awake longer and be able to put their fear away so they could kill another person.
Yeah, Hitler and his troops were famously on amphetamines, which is why they thought they could march through Russia in the day.
So were ours as well. I mean, we still give our combat pilots some form of amphetamines to keep them alert, not so much awake, but just alert. And so that there's your progression of drugs, with amphetamines being the big one that would have come in post World War II. And then around the 60s, then cortisol shows up. Okay. And so now you have this additional method by which you can actually stave off pain, but also make yourself alert. And a lot of cyclists through the 70s and 80s would put together this concoction that was morphine, amphetamines, and then cortisol. And they would just give you an injection of it. And so you're nice and loose, no pain, and you're also really awake and ready to ride. Yeah. You can push until it wears off and then you crash. But then came through the grandfather of them all in terms of drugs. Now, testosterone and anabolic steroids would have come in there as well, but not for the purposes of putting on bulk. Bulk is the death knell for any cyclist.
Right.
Okay, so what you want for the testosterone is to take little teeny microdoses to assist with recovery between days on the tour. But then when EPO, erythropoietin, shows up, right around 89, 88, 89, this is a drug. Now, we make EPO naturally. Our kidneys make it in order to maintain our red blood cell count. If we go to high altitude, then we will release more EPO into our system. Our bone marrow makes more red blood cells to make up for the fact that there's a lack of oxygen content at that altitude. If you have a big bleed, you get cut, you get a crush injury. Women, when they menstruate, they'll get a little spike in EPO to make up for some of the blood loss that they had. So if you can find a way to inject this drug instead of having to go through all the trouble of altitude training and the like, then you just get a big spike in red blood cells, which increases your capacity to carry oxygen to your muscles, and huge, huge improvements. Okay, so think of it this way. If we have the Tour de France and we look at the first place to dead last, from this last year, from first place to last place, which was Mark Cavendish, who was not trying to win the Tour de France, he just wanted to get one more stage win to break the record, is about 7.5%. Okay, the difference between taking EPO and not taking EPO is about 10%. So you can see why it had such a tremendous impact on the ability of these really big cyclists who had no business going up mountains the way they were to all of a sudden be able to do so. So there is the lineage of the different drugs that were popular over a course of time during the Tour de France. And it wasn't until around 2000 that they actually developed a test for it. But then there's still ways around that test, because the test was developed by one of the people who was one of the doctors who was doping. Working it from both sides. So I choose the Tour de France because it is probably one of the best sports to show the evolution of drug taking and doping over time. So when you couldn't take EPO in the same quantities you were taking it anymore, workaround. We're going to take our blood out. We'll store it for a couple weeks, and then when we come to the stage that we need to get that blood back in, we'll inject it right back into our body. So that's fine. You better store that blood well, and you better not mix up the two bags. And this stuff happened all the time, where a bad bag was allowed to lyse, and then you give this person an injection or an infusion of a full unit of lysed red blood cells, and they get so incredibly sick. And this has happened at least 3 times in documentation.
Did anybody die from this?
We don't know.
Very serious.
We don't know that. We do have suspicions that people died from taking EPO because their blood gets so thick that when they're laying down, it makes it that much harder for the heart to beat this very viscous blood. And so there were some young athletes, cyclists in particular, in their early 20s who were dying of heart attacks in the middle of the night. We don't have any empirical evidence to show that it was EPO. But all the circumstantial evidence would lead you to believe that is the case. So there is a vested interest within cycling to prevent athletes from dying because they're taking this damn drug. So they've got to find something to do about this. and the best poster child to get, and also to satisfy a whole lot of French people and Europeans who saw Lance Armstrong break and then far surpass the record of the total number of Tour de France victories from 5 to 7. He's out. Now, not only is he out, but we're not going to replace him with anybody below him as being the righteous winner of those 7 years. So if you look at the Tour de France list of winners for 7 years, nothing. Even though they could have replaced him with somebody. The reason why they do that, because they knew that there was no one that they could turn to as being the second, third, fourth, fifth place winner who could be elevated that wasn't also under suspicion for taking drugs.
Yeah, well, it's a vicious cycle for them, but one that they kind of signed up for in the moment.
They sure did.
You point out that baseball is another good example of a sport that greatly benefited from turning a blind eye to their athletes taking performance-enhancing drugs. In their case, it was steroids in the late 1990s. Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, the summer of 98, that crazy home run chase that both guys end up eclipsing Maris's mark. And a lot of these guys are still having to pay the price for that. Sammy Sosa recently is finally about to get back together with the Cubs after admitting that he didn't make the best decisions at times when he was with Chicago, but it's funny / sad to see guys like Bud Selig continue to insist that they didn't totally understand what was going on.
I don't believe that for a second.
I mean, if the common fan knew exactly what was going on, of course you did, if nothing else, if not having high-level conversations about how you should properly be handling something that you know has a sort of nefariousness to it, just in terms of the basic idea of cheating in sports.
Totally. And the notion that he knew nothing.
That's silly.
Number one, it's silly. Number two, if it's true, then, I mean, dereliction of duty. It's your job to know something. You're the commissioner of the sport. It's
like Art Briles with the scandal at Baylor a decade
sex
plus
scandal,
ago.
the rape scandal at Baylor. He should have known.
Yeah.
He didn't.
Yeah.
So therein lies the biggest problem I have. And then not only do we have the circus of this very well-educated man who's making a lot of money off of baseball, telling stories that I don't necessarily believe, but it was in front of Congress. I mean, Congress stopped down operations to have hearings about baseball. There's nothing more important y'all have to deal with than this. Now, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm sure Congress in 2003 and 5 could have handled more than one big issue at a time. That's fine.
They clearly cared about the children, Alexander.
That's really what it came down to. And that's the auspices under which they actually have these hearings, is that we have to protect the children. Okay, so I mean, I did my own research to see, what was the rate of not just PED usage amongst adolescents and youth prior to the hearings and after the hearings, but also what's the death rate? And it's basically the exact same. So these hearings meant nothing in terms of preventing anybody from using these drugs because people want to win. Secondly, the death rate from illicit drugs and alcohol amongst these same age groups, significantly higher. I mean, several orders of magnitude higher. But we don't have hearings on advertisements of alcohol and appealing to younger people. It's just nonsense. And so again, in the case of Lance Armstrong coming back in '98, that was the tour where it was called the Festina Affair, and that was the biggest cycling team in the world at that time. And one of their team cars was caught at the Belgian-French border right before the tour started, and he was just chock-a-block full of drugs. And so the French police got that team, and then they went around and got all the peripheral teams. Particularly, they were going after the French athletes because they had jurisdiction over them. They were up all night with interrogations. There are rumors of body cavity searches. We had several teams that just dropped out altogether instead of having to even deal with the scenario. So the tour could have easily just fallen apart entirely. And then the very next year, the Tour of Redemption, Lance shows up and he wins it out of nowhere. Having been gone from the sport, at least the tour, for at least 3 years at that point. And so, there you have the savior coming in, and everybody just flooded into the sport and watched. I did too.
Yeah.
Then, as a corollary,
the sport has never been more popular than 7 years.
Never. As a corollary, you have Major League Baseball. In 1994, they have a strike that cancels the World Series. The first time that's happened since the very second of all the World Series that ever existed. So it'd been well over 100 years at that point. By the time they came back, it was about a third of the way into the 1995 season, attendance was just down. Understandably, the fans were pissed off that we're having this argument between millionaires and billionaires. I want to watch baseball. And so, for 4 years there, it was just not good. Baseball was in big trouble until here comes Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire. Now, usually when you have a home run race, there's one athlete.
Yeah.
It's that person versus himself. In this case, you had two who were going after it together, and they're in the same division. They're both in Midwestern cities, which makes a difference. And they're both telegenic. They interview well. They're very happy people, and they actually liked each other. So when, there's this race going on, and finally when it came down to the point where we thought, I think it's going to get broken this weekend, it happens during a 3-game series between the Cubs and the Cardinals in St. Louis.
Who are huge rivals too, by the way.
Huge rivals to boot. Right.
Yeah.
So then you have all this animus that's there that gets washed away by the good feelings between the two athletes and the fact that they're chasing this record. They bring out Maris's family. I mean, that's a checkered past right there. All right, let me say that differently. The way he was treated made it so it was a checkered past.
Yeah.
Right. So the year in 61, when he was chasing his record to beat 60, which was Babe Ruth's, they had just expanded the season by 8 games. And so there was going to be an asterisk placed next to his record because it was too long a season.
Baseball and its asterisks.
So then, they brought him, well, he was already dead at that point, but they brought his family out to celebrate the breaking of the record so they could finally pay attention to him like he should have been given back in the day in 61. So you have, a tying of the record and then a breaking of the record in St. Louis. And it's this enormous, amazing event. But then the race isn't over yet. So there's still like 20 games left. And Sosa catches up and they're tied at 66. And so, finally, that was it for Sosa. He didn't hit any more from that. But then McGwire hits 4 more to get to 70. So you have, if you look at the home run record, it went from 58 in 27 to 59 sometime in the 30s to 60. So one home run at a time. And then Maris hits it at 61. And now you have the second place guy for that year, 67 or 66. A huge number. He beats it by 5 at least. And then, but that's not even enough to break the record and have it for himself. McGwire gets to 79 more home runs than the previous record. That should have been glaring enough that there's something different about these particular guys, because the progression of this record is one home run at a time over the course of 70 years. And now all of a sudden we got 2 guys that are well ahead of it. And if you look at them through the progression of their careers, Sammy Sosa used to be a string bean. Now, McGwire was always a big boy, but he got big. I mean, like Hulk big. And so all you have to do is take pictures of them over the course of their careers, and you can still see, that they're juiced. They're juiced. And so for Bud Selig to say, I didn't know because nobody came to tell me. All you have to do is have a pair of eyes, Bud. It's not very hard. And so to know that these 2 guys saved the sport, and they literally did, to see them get eviscerated and just chucked under any type of vehicle you can put out there is remarkably unfair.
What is Clenbuterol, and what do you find so interesting about it?
So Clenbuterol is an interesting drug. It's kind of like a jack of all trades drug. It is a drug that was meant for reducing asthma. So it's going to have effects similar to what adrenaline would do. So it's going to open up your bronchial tubes. That's what it was designed for. But in addition to that, it acts as a central nervous system stimulant. Okay, so it makes it so that you're hyped and ready to compete. But then it also has anabolic effects too. So it impacts the body in a number of different ways. It's used illicitly and illegally, and it's not even legal in this country, never has been, in the poultry and beef industries to make their cattle bigger. Now, most countries have banned this, but there are still ranchers who will use it because they have a desire to make more money. You make more money if your cattle is bigger and they get to market faster.
Especially in third world countries.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have to be necessarily developed countries. I mean, so there's still scandals here in this country where it's used. The story that I relate to in terms of Clenbuterol is another athlete. His name is Alberto Contador. So in 2010, he won the Tour, and then afterwards they tested his blood for a number of different drugs, and they came back that he was positive for minuscule amounts of Clenbuterol. Now, his excuse for why it ended up in his system was that they were in a French border town in the Pyrenees, and the meat that they had there wasn't particularly good. This is not uncommon. So they had an executive chef with their team who drove across the Spanish border and picked up some beef there, brought it back, and made dinner for everybody that night. So we know that it had to happen that night because as the leader of the tour for those 6 days, he was tested 2 days before, the day after and one more day, and then 2 more days because he was in yellow jersey for that period of time. The only time that they found Clenbuterol is the day after he ate it, and then the day after that. And then even then, on the second day that he tested positive was only half as much as he had the day before. So it's already leaving his system. And the amount is so remarkably small that it could never have possibly had any type of performance-enhancing impact on him whatsoever. So either he took it stupidly, hoping that it would have some impact at a remarkably small level that was still detectable, but wasn't going to help him, which nobody is going to allow him to do that amongst his team of handlers. Or he's telling the truth. And it was this tainted beef that allowed him to get this into his system. Now, there's a precedent for this. And I write about this too in the world in my book. There was an under-21 World Cup that was held in Mexico City, and a number of athletes from several of the teams tested positive for Clenbuterol. It was because of the beef. But guess which team didn't test positive for Clenbuterol?
The Mexican team.
The Mexican team. They only allowed their athletes to eat fish because they had already had an issue with Clenbuterol-tainted beef. But they didn't tell anybody.
Oh, those taco stands are so tempting, though.
It's infuriating to have to listen to this. So if you have a precedent that's already been set that's proven that meat can contaminate your bloodstream to give you a positive, do something about this. We got to do something. There has to be a threshold at which this drug has to be higher than this in order for it to have a performance-enhancing effect. Then we'll start to talk about whether we're going to punish you or not. But you can't just say, it's in there, period. I don't care how it got in there. You're punished.
We as a people are unable to completely get along over anything. So what is the solution here? How do we get everybody on the same page with regards to the idea of performance-enhancing substances, what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed, Alexander?
So we need a number of different stakeholders to have a voice. First and foremost, the athletes. Mm-hmm. It's their work that I'm paying my ticket price for to go watch. They are the product. So obviously they should have a voice in whether or not they should even be allowed to take this. Now there's some of this is going to be a legal thing within any of the given countries. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because obviously HGH, there's only 3 different types of patients who can take it, and athletes are not going to fall into any of those categories. Same thing is true for anabolic steroids. Unless you have a prescription from your doctor, it's not legal for you to possess that as you're walking around town.
But people would be surprised at what is considered legal versus illegal from country to country. As a matter of fact, Japan, where the Tokyo Games were held in 2021, Adderall is something that you are not allowed to have large amounts of, and a lot of athletes have that prescription, are allowed to perform with Adderall in their system, and as a result of not being allowed to bring as much as they needed to into Tokyo, their performance suffered as well.
So that would be a therapeutic use exemption, and so you're absolutely right about that too. How are we going to get to a better place than we are is to not have a centralized organization that has a monetary invested interest in keeping all the power to themselves. And the only way that you're going to get to that place is by allowing for athletes to collectively bargain. Now, therein lies where the trick is, because unless that comes from the athletes, unless you have a group of athletes who just say, I'm not going to continue on with the sport until we get a collective bargaining going on here. How do you get to that point? It's either going to be a series of strikes that are going to take place or competition in the form of this new enhanced games that are going to be coming online sometime in the next 12 months. Now, just like we saw with golf, so we had the PGA Tour, we had a lot of its players who were complaining about the number of tournaments that they had to play in and the size of the purses being too small, but because PGA was all there was, they have no collective bargaining there until LIV shows up. And then LIV is able to give substantially more money to its athletes and basically poaches all these athletes over to its flock. And then what is the PGA Tour's immediate response? They increase the purchase. The purses. No shit. Shocking. So the enhanced games is now going to give $50,000 for a gold medal and $1 million for a world record. So how does the USOC respond, or the International Olympic Committee? They are now starting to consider at least giving some cash prizes to their athletes when they win a gold medal. Shocking when things are not a monopoly. and you don't have to bring in antitrust laws, how things will change. But everything about this argument revolves around giving the athletes more of a say. And that is exactly what I am a proponent of, and I'm working pretty hard towards that end. And I think the enhanced games, although I don't agree with everything they're doing, I think that it's a positive step forward in allowing them to get more representation.
So let me ask you something based on that then, because you said that you're not necessarily for doping, but you obviously want to see the rules loosened with regards to what is considered a performance-enhancing drug. What do you think should remain illegal in terms of what athletes are allowed to take for the sake of their sport, for the sake of their individual performance?
Well, there's a lot of drugs that are out there that people are taking that are not even FDA approved. So they're still in an experimental stage. And that always makes me anxious. I don't think it's a good idea for anybody, let alone children, to be experimenting with something that we just don't know what the full impacts of this are, short-term or long. So if you're going to be taking something, take something that's going to be tried and true and that we know, and we have lots and lots of testing data on this in terms of what the potential ramifications could be, negative or positive. And then I'm not really interested in seeing athletes take these drugs so that they can beat somebody else. Where I want these drugs to be allowed to be taken is to keep them on the playing field, to get them over an injury quicker. And certainly, the illicit drugs have got to be removed from this list. And marijuana is tops on that list. You just cannot have a situation where even in our country, we're starting to loosen these regulations on this drug.
Most of the U.S. sports, I think have completely eliminated testing for weed.
For sure. Certainly out of competition testing. They still do in-competition testing, and I'm fine with that. If somebody shows up and they're stoned out of their mind, I don't want them playing football.
Well, you better not watch the NBA then.
Yeah, well, there's that. Okay, so but there's less of a chance of there being this ballistic collision between two people because someone's stoned in basketball than there is football. But they can do what they want as far as that's concerned. But even then, if they catch you taking it in an NBA game, they're just going to pull you for the game and just say, you have an injury this day. Don't do it again, or we'll have to suspend you for a couple of games. So, again, therein lies what I'm talking about. It's the athletes who and their players union who put forth those particular changes to the rules to make it so that we don't have to be penalizing everything in the world when there's much more important things out there than that. So, again, to kind of reiterate my point, I don't mind if an athlete takes a drug for the purposes of enhancing their performance, but that drug should be allowed to be taken by all athletes, not just the ones who have the best doctors and the best trainers and the best everybody, although it would be nice if we could at least get some level of leveling that playing field in terms of the support staff that's needed to actually take these drugs safely. But for certain, it's not fair for Rafa Nadal to be able to numb his foot completely to play and win the French Open if we're also not going to allow for the same thing to happen in other sports. The fact that he was able to do that, he made a conscious decision on his own that he had this foot that has a chronic injury or chronic disease to it, basically where a bone is falling apart because it doesn't get enough blood flow, that causes these remarkably sharp pains in his foot. He's going to get that thing numbed. And maybe also have taken cortisol. We don't know because we have never heard that substantially or clearly whether or not he actually took that too. But still, you have a guy who's running around with a foot that's completely numb and he can't feel it. There's obvious danger to the athlete there, but they allowed it. And I think they should have. That's his choice to take that risk at that time, and he won. But if you're going to allow for him to do it, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You got to open that up for everybody else too, because there's plenty of other athletes who would have made that same choice.
I think respecting bodily autonomy is a big part of this equation. Any parting thoughts before I bid you adieu, Alexander?
I want to thank you for reaching out. I'm happy to come back any other time. I've got a lot of other things that we can certainly talk about within this particular topic, but certainly within the trans in sport topic as well.
Well, thank you very much for the time. It's been a real pleasure, man.
Oh, can I plug my website real quick?
Yeah, please do.
It is goodegg.fitness. So good egg is one word, GOODEGG.fitness. And you can find all the pods I've been on, all the books that I've written, and several of my other essays there as well.